Okay, today I'm going to bring in some back-end validation into my website that I'm building in Node and Express currently, the back end. And so the library that I'm going to bring in is called Joy. The website is joy.dev, and we'll be writing some middleware to validate our data as well. So I have my website that I've been building for BellevilleRunningClub.com. There should be a playlist from beginning to current state on my channel. So follow that playlist if you want to know how I got where I'm at. I would encourage you to follow along from the beginning. But what I will be doing is installing Joy and bringing in Joy and the convention on this on their docs is with a capital J, even though it's just a convention. Obviously don't have to do that. And maybe kind of the easy spot to start would be when we're adding a user. And so the way this will work is we will go ahead and create a schema for what a new user should have. And I have a database schema that I've drafted up of what a user should have: username, email, password, given family, address, and those will be the fields that when a new user registers, we should be able to bring in. Now, one thing to consider is that I also want my users to be able to use their Google account to register. And so, taking that into account, do I have to force all of these fields when I am using Google? In other words, you might not be able to extract that from a Google account. And so to just kind of glance at that as I'm considering this, I can kind of show a table of data that I've pulled on users. And so this was just my information, and you could see I've got a display name, given name and family name. So I can extract those pieces of information, but like address is definitely not something I can extract. So I can get given and family. I'll make those required. Email was in there, I believe. Obviously I should be able to get my email. Interestingly enough, it's not even, when I pulled out that, it was not giving me that piece of information. And so for now, I will make email required, password required. Obviously, you're not storing passwords. So I'm going to make email password required, and I'm not going to worry about at the moment. I can change this later on when I'm pulling the account information from Google. Obviously, you don't need a password because Google saves the password when you're authenticating with Google. Anyways, so I'm going to make... Once you bring in the package, you can make a schema, and I will say a new user schema. So underneath my router is a joy.object, and given name Now, okay, given name will be a string, min and max and required. So, you know, this is kind of the code fill. Sure, minimum of 3, max of 30. I can get behind that and we'll say family name. We can get behind that. We'll say email. You can notice we're bringing in a joint string email. And password. Now, password credentials, the longer passwords, the better. You know, obviously you have to let your user know your password requirements. You know, making a minimum password of 3 is not a good idea, but for now we'll just set the low bar of a password of 3. So here's our schema, and we will now on our add, we will add a piece of middleware called valid body. And so we're going to write our first piece of middleware called valid body. This is going to be in a folder called middleware. So I'm going to make a folder here called middleware. And inside of the middleware, I'm going to make my own valid body.js. And middleware takes a little bit of getting used to writing. So the convention here is to write a function that takes in a schema. And that function returns an anonymous function, as you see here. This is where we actually call schema validate rec.body, and I'm going to say abort early is false. And so this is going to give us our validation results, whether we're meeting the schema rules or we're not. And abort early of false says to give us multiple errors. If there are multiple errors, give us multiple errors. Otherwise, if you don't do this, you get the first error that is found. And then we can say, if there's an error, let's see if this looks right, return back to the client, res status 400 JSON. We'll say errors, validation result, error details. And so I'm going to refactor this a little bit different. So I'm going to have a single error, even though there may be multiple, and I'm just going to stop at the error object. Okay, so if there's errors, send back to the client the error object. Else, if there's no errors, we modify rec.body to be the validation results.value. So there will be a new property on the rec.body. If there are no error messages, we are modifying the request object to store a validation result, and then we call next, which is to say run the next function in the middleware pipeline. Close, close, semi, close, semi, and then we export our function called valid body. So we wrote a function. That function returns an anonymous function that basically does one of two things. Okay, so we wrote our first little middleware. So let's bring in that middleware now. So I'm going to import valid body from our, let's see, our path is all incorrect. So to get our path correct, let's see. So user does need to go up 2 directories down, and this is called valid body.js. So it did find it, so that's good. Okay, so we just had to change that file name. And now that we wrote that middleware, we can use it on our route. So this is the user route. This is the add user, and we can call the middleware function called valid body, passing it our schema that we created called new user schema. Put a comma right there. And now if we send a new user in that doesn't meet our schema given family, email, and password, we'll get an error kind of coming back our way. So let's boot up our server with npm run dev. And let's see. Okay. Somehow I brought in this accidentally. That is not correct. So let's remove that. Okay. I'm going to remove that console log. It's interesting. Connecting to database. Where is that coming? And let's see. Connect to database. Console log. Delete that. Save that. Okay, good. Gotta change my password again. Okay, so new user schema, we're on port 5000, and let's see if we try to add a new user that doesn't match the schema, what happens? Boot up Postman. And I do have an add new user route. This is my login route. Let me save that. Call this the login route. And this is on BRC. Okay. In fact, I can add another folder here for user routes. I'm going to drag all of these into that. So if I go to list all users, you could see I'm still able to list, well, I've got 1 user currently. And if I go to add new user, just an email and password, you would expect that to error out. And there you can see given name is required. And family name is required. And it says username is not allowed. Which is, oh, right there. Okay. So again, to go back to here, I do have a username, which I left off. Okay. So it becomes username or email. You really need one or the other. I'd rather have the email. So I'm going to not worry about a username. I'm just going to use my email for that piece. But those are the errors. Now, just for experimentation points, right? I'm going to Control Z on this. Okay, notice that I changed, if I Control Y, the error object versus the details object. So I'm going to bring in, I'm going to call this errors. I'm going to copy this line, and then I'm just going to undo or redo. Whoop, 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 whoop. Okay, bring this back to the way I had it. Okay, and then I'm going to replace this line with the details instead. Okay, so if I go now and I hit that, so here's errors. It's an array of objects with a message that says given name is required. family name is required, username is required. And so maybe we change the message, right? So in my schema, if there is an error, you might change the message. Let me hit the docs real quick and look that up. We can parse through this, but the way this is working, and I just paste this in when I was paused, you add a dot messages, and then based on the type of error message, if it's empty, it says given name cannot be empty. Minimum should be a minimum length of 3. So let's go to given name. And just put in the letter E. We should see that particular error message. And so you can play with all these different validation messages, enjoy. And that would be a good idea. I can essentially copy this since these are all strings. You know, or you could just be okay with the default error messages. I think I'm just going to be okay with the default error messages. Now that we did that work, it's not that big of a difference. So given family, email, and password. Given, if I take this back, yeah, it's giving me so if I put my given name in, let's given family name. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now user already exists, which is good. We put that validation in there. But if I change to my Gmail, it was always based on that. We say, okay, user added successfully. I can go to my database on my Belleville Running Club users. There we see my Gmail user, and the password is hashed. So let's now flush out maybe we're going to write another middleware for object IDs, making sure we have valid object IDs. There's my new user schema. We don't need to list. We don't need permissions to list our users, or excuse me, a schema for listing, but let's do a login schema. And for logging in, we just need an email and a password. Pretty straightforward. And now that we wrote that middleware function, we could say valid body login schema. So now if we try and log in without an email or a password, we're going to get some validation. Not a valid email. Okay, leave the password out. Backend validation, password is required. Okay, let's write another middleware function. Again, these middleware are a little different because they are functions that return functions. So we're going to write valid ID.js. And this one is a function that takes in a param. So this function takes a param, and we're going to return rec res and next. And we're going to try. Catch error E and return res status 400 JSON error and this will say object ID. No.
My anxiety.
Okay, so what goes in the try block, we're going to import object ID from MongoDB. And yep, that's right. So we're going to add to rec.params. So this will be rec.params.parameter name equal to converting the object or rec.params sub. Yeah, basically converting that parameter name into, which is going to be a string, it's going to be the ID, into an object ID. So this is creating a rec.params called ID equal to the converted object ID from that string. And now we export valid ID. And I need the keyword new here, new object ID, which that tends to throw that line through it, and it says it's deprecated, which is a new thing. So I might need to write and figure out a new way to write that. But this will put the object ID inside of rec.params. And so let's bring in on our users. Let's import valid ID from valid ID.js. Okay, so here's like an example of getting a user ID. And we're going to say valid ID, and then in quotes. Now I'm going to refactor this. Okay, I'm going to open this up. I'm just going to make this called ID, and then you pass in these two variable names have to match. So the identifier here matches the identifier here. I'm going to put a comma. And then instead of getting this from rec.params user ID, it's rec.params.id. Wait a minute. Oh, I wrote that wrong. Let me go back to valid ID. This is written wrong. This is rec sub param name. There we go. Rec sub param name is a new object ID. I knew something didn't look right. So now it's whatever's attached to the rec object. So it's rec.id. So going back to my user.js, now instead of getting this from rec.params, we just go rec.id, and this will be the object ID. Okay, and so if it's an invalid object ID, we should get an error message there. So let's go to getting our user by ID. So let's kind of list all users, and there's that. Let's get a user by ID, and we should be able to get that user, which looks fine. Now if I don't pass a valid ID, we get ID's not valid object ID, which comes from our middleware. All the way back here, right there, not a valid object ID. And so if you pass any string that's not a valid object ID, which is a certain number of hex characters, hexadecimal characters. I think it's like 16 hexadecimal values. But if you pass it like a 1, which is a valid, this is a valid object ID, it gets through, but it just sends back, hey, we couldn't get your user, because that's not the middleware that's hitting it, that's not Joy. That is our route saying error getting the user, because the user wasn't found here. Okay, so to go through our user routes, we got the list. That doesn't need Joy. We're getting a user by ID. This would also be refactored. I would call this : you could use the variable name like that. I just prefer ID. And I'm going to say the same valid ID middleware, passing it the ID, comma, and then refactor this. Okay, now this one's interesting because what? Well, we've got optional fields for our users. So you could also do valid body here, but just not make it required. So for example, here would be our schema, const update user schema. And notice this is given, family, email, and password. It's all the same stuff, just leaving off the required. So we, if we try and update our, let's see. Now, one thing I want to make sure is that notice when I created a user, I hashed their password and I made sure they weren't an existing user. But notice here, get rid of that debug. Here we hashed the user's password. So I want to do the same thing. If user has a password being updated, we need to definitely hash that password. So here's current user. And I can do something like if current user, keep in mind they might give you an ID that's no good. So I'm not sure. Is updating their no, wait a minute, hold on. Okay, if updated user has a password, then we're going to hash it. Okay, so we got to make sure that we keep our passwords hashed in the database. Simple if statement there. Okay, and let's go ahead and add in valid body, passing it our schema, which is update user schema. Okay, so a route to update. And so basically, like for example, if I try and set a password of like 1, so let's get my user, I think this was a 0. Okay, so here's my user, and I can log in as my user. Let's go to update user by ID. So if I pass in a user and I update my password to all ones, okay, I get an error updating user. So let's see what happens. Now I'm kind of curious if I go in here and refresh. Okay. If the modified count is 1, so let's, right here, I'm going to do a debug user. And I'm also going to get the DB results. Okay. So I want to see updating user ID with that information, as well as get the DB results printed into my console. And so pull up the terminal. Okay. Updating user undefined. Okay, so it is kind of barking at my ID. Oh, because this is now rec.id. I forgot to refactor that. Now it says updated successfully. Acknowledged is true. Modified count is 1. And I should be able to refresh. So now my Gmail should have all, my password should be 1s. So if I log in with my Gmail, and there's my old password. It says it doesn't match. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ones, I think. And my login route's not happy. So let's see what's going on with my login route. Did not get a response from login. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, I'm not sure. I have no idea what just happened there. If I change one character, we're getting no good. Okay. Glitch in the system, I'm not sure, but everything seems to be working. And we now have, let me kind of bring this back down. I'll take these debugs out of my updates. Minimize these schemas. Okay, list doesn't need anything. Validating our ID, validating our ID, validating our new users, and validating our login schema. Okay, yeah, awesome. So this is Joy. This is a quick overview of Joy, writing some middleware, which is definitely some of the more cryptic syntax. Again, a middleware function is just something that happens in between the request and the response. So the request from the client, the response from the server. It's a function that runs, and a typical convention for middleware is for them to return a function. And what middleware typically does, so you can see we're returning an anonymous arrow function, and what a middleware function typically does is it can modify the request object itself. So here we're adding a parameter name that's passed into this valid ID function to the request object. And on this one, we are, let's see, what are we doing here? We are modifying our rec.body, again, modifying the request object. Okay, now the last thing I'm going to do here is that we've made a lot of changes since our last deployment to Google Cloud. So I'm going to go ahead and redeploy to Google Cloud and do some testing. And so the first thing I need to do is gcloud set project. And so I'm going to go to my Google Cloud, just cloud.google.com, go to my console, and there's my project ID. So I'm pretty sure that my project ID is set, but I'm just going to make sure that I'm working in that project. So gcloud config set and paste project, I should say, project with the project ID. Okay. So now the correct gcloud run command, gcloud run deploy, and I have to provide the service name. So let me go into here, let me go into gcloud run, cloud run, and I call it brc-service. So the command becomes gcloud run deploy brc-service. Okay, and just before I redeploy, let's just glance at that service and hit the app. Okay, and we get a front end. And what is it? API user list is hitting the right route. So I just responded with user list, which is good. Now, it's been a while since I've refactored this, so it'll be interesting because I probably need to open up some things in my database to let this continue to work on gcloud. So this will be a good, okay, and I'll just say root directory. I'm going to choose central. Okay, I'm going to let this spin. Okay, we have the service redeployed, and so it's up and running, front end's up and running. If we go /API user list, okay, we are hitting our database and getting our 2 users. And so we can confirm that our back end is up and running and responding to routes. And I must have already opened up the database, so that's good. If it doesn't work for you when it's deployed, you want to go to your MongoDB, look at your firewall rules, and you want to open it up to allow either the IP address from your Google Cloud server, or since it's serverless, you might just open up, open up the ports or open up the IP addresses. And so, yeah, so I can maybe demo that really quick. Log into Mongo. Type in a password to get to your passwords. And so what you do is you go to network access, and you can either add individual ports, or notice here, if you go to add IP address, and if you put in all zeros, it opens it up. And so again, just for temporary purposes, you can open up all the IP addresses, and that'll work. Now, of course, we need to, if we throw in user by ID, you get some error messages that's, not getting a user by the ID. But point is, our backend routes are working. So we're in a good spot to stop.